So what is pine plywood? It's going to sound like I'm taking the mickey out of you now, but pine plywood is plywood made from pine. However, sometimes pine plywood refers to plywood that has pine on the two outer surfaces. In other words, the top and the bottom of the ply board has got pine. And sometimes there's all kinds of other stuff in between. So it depends on where you're getting your pine plywood from and who the manufacturer is and where it comes from and all those things. Let's just, for the sake of the discussion, talk about plywood that is made from pine and pine only. All the layers of the pine ply are made from pine. Now, we all know that pine, although it's classified as a softwood, you do get different grades of pine. You get pine that grows incredibly slowly and the grain is very tight, and you get pine that grows very, very quickly and it's actually not incredibly strong pine, where your growth rings are actually really far apart. When you're buying pine ply, know that you could be buying something that is of higher quality and will definitely cost you more. So you could use ply made out of birch, for example, or maple, or you can get all different kinds of wood in plywood. So pine ply is obviously much more cost effective. If it's used for the right purpose, it can be incredibly good. So pine ply is, let's just call it's ply that's made, for all the layers in the plywood are made from pine. Is pine ply any good? Well, that's kind of like one of those questions where it's like, how long is a piece of string? Any good for what is the real question. Each plywood, and it doesn't matter if you're talking about the most expensive plywood you can buy or the cheapest plywood you can buy, if it's used for the right purpose, it's not just good, it's perfect. So you could use shutterboard or shutter ply, which is made out of pine, and is of an inferior grade with lots of knots and imperfections on the surface. But if you're using it for formwork like pouring concrete and closing up holes in windows and doing things like that, then certainly it's the perfect ply for the job. So it's good for that job. If you want it to be furniture grade stuff, well, then you may have to search slightly harder and longer for plywood that is pine but also is of a good grade. So like here, for example, this is pine ply that is quite a good grade of pine ply. So it's beautiful. It's got no knots on it. It's quite clean. It's actually really pretty. But yes, it's pine ply. So is it good for furniture, this one? Yeah, you could make some furniture out of this. You could make some cabinets out of this and it wouldn't look out of place. So you get various grades of pine plywood. And I think the answer to the question is yes, it is good. No matter what the use is, use the right grade pine plywood for your project and it will be perfect for your project. Is pine wood and plywood the same? No, they're not the same. One is a natural product, one is a manufactured product. The manufactured product is made up of very thin slices of the natural product. So the content is actually exactly the same, but the structure and the behavior of the two things are very, very different. So let's say you are dealing with pine plywood. Plywood made from pine is made up of thin slices and they are laminated or glued together in alternating grain patterns. In other words, one goes this way, one goes that way, one goes this way, one goes that way, etc. What that does do is it creates an incredibly strong and very stable board, which is dimensionally stable. And what that means is it doesn't shrink or expand. It stays dimensionally stable. It stays quite flat, and it is something that you can use with some confidence because you know that it's going to behave in a certain way. Whereas pine is just cut straight from rough cut lumber. There you are exposing yourself to the opportunities of wood being able to bend or cup or warp or twist or all of those things that natural wood would do, because of the fact that once you start cutting a tree down, moisture tends to escape out of it. You get cracking, you get checking, and you get all kinds of natural, normal behaviors in wood. So one is not necessarily better than the other, but for each individual purpose, one might be better suited to its task than the other. Is pine plywood durable? The answer to that is yes, it is. However, and this is the big catch here, is that Pine plywood by itself may not be durable. If you put the right finish on pine plywood, it can become durable. If pine plywood is glued together with waterproof glues, it can be more durable. Certainly I have workshop furniture that I made out of pine plywood 15 years ago, and it's still behaving exactly like it behaved on the day that I made it. It's still perfect. It hasn't warped or twisted or broken or cracked or any of that stuff. So yes, it can be very, very durable. But I did seal it with something. I did use it correctly. I didn't put it together in a way that it opens itself up to failing and what have you. So a little bit of know-how, and you can just about do anything with pine plywood. By the way, and if you do want to know more about the best way to finish wood, then we've got a video up here where you can see the cool ways to finish wood and what else we can do to protect wood. If the question is pine wood stronger than pine ply, then the answer is no, it's not. Very often it's not. It can be, but most likely it's not. The reason for that is if I have a look at the edge of this plywood board and you really look nice and close, you'll see that the layers over here are very thin layers. So you've got lots of thin little layers over here, which means that this is compacted, it's very, very hard, and its grains alternating, as opposed to a board which is solid pine. And you'll notice even on this board how far apart the rings are here. So if you look at these growth rings, you'll notice the dark lines are winter growth, the light lines are summer growth, and summer growth is where the tree expands and grows very, very quickly. So now, the further apart these growth rings are, you'll notice the weaker the tree actually is, because it's made up of more softwood than the hard winter growth rings. So what you really want is, if you're going to look for pine that you want to be very, very strong, then you're looking for something that has your grain much, much more tightly together. So in other words, tighter growth rings. And inevitably that's going to be where the pine tree is growing in an incredibly cold environment. So it grows very slowly. That's why things like Baltic pine is so strong, because Baltic pine grows on the border of Germany and Russia in the snow. So it's incredibly tight grained and very strong, very dense pine, which makes it much, much stronger than pine that grows too quickly with growth rings that are very far apart. So more often than not, plywood is actually stronger. It's dimensionally stable and physically stronger. It's more difficult to break a piece of plywood than what it is to break a piece of pine. Okay, so what is the strongest type of plywood? People ask. I mean, which type? There's so many different kinds of plywood. Which is the one that is the strongest? It's a very simple question to answer, because the plywood with the most number of layers is the strongest. So historically and traditionally, birch plywood has the most number of layers within a certain space. So let's say an 18 mil thick piece of birch plywood may have as many as 12 or 11 or 12 layers of plywood in it, which makes it incredibly dense and very, very strong. So the simplest way to answer the question is, the more layers your plywood has, the stronger it's going to be. So the strongest ply is the one with the most layers, every time. If you have any more questions about plywood or plywood related issues, or even just a suggestion or whatever it is, then put some comments in the comment section down below. We'll try and get back to you, and we do Q&As every now and again, so if you want to just leave us a message, we will get back to you. So yeah, just let us know what's on your mind. If you have any questions, we'll try and answer them.